The first thing Elara noticed was the blood-dark, sticky, and still warm smearing the thin layer of snow that clung stubbornly to the porch of her cabin. The winter storm had roared in the night, tearing across the Arizona plains with icy talons, and now the air howled like a chorus of wild spirits. She squinted against the gray-white glare, her heart hammering in her chest, and saw him crouched behind the split-rail fence, shaking, his long black hair matted with snow and blood. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat, to lock the door and pretend she had seen nothing. But something in the way he moved, half crawling, half dragging himself, spoke of desperation that was impossible to ignore. She had lived alone for years, carving a hard life from unforgiving land, but she had never turned away from a soul in need. Not when the wind could kill you as easily as men could. Elara, she whispered to herself, the sound of her own name tasting foreign on her lips. She wasn't used to saying it aloud. Her father had died when she was young, leaving her to manage the small cabin alone. That name belonged to someone capable, fearless, someone she sometimes struggled to recognize in herself. The man's dark eyes caught hers, glazed with pain but sharp with awareness. A long scar traced his cheek, fading into the dirt, and blood caked on his face. His clothing had once been finely made, perhaps ceremonial or tribal, now shredded and sodden from the storm. Elara recognized instantly he was Apache, hunted and bleeding. Danger clung to him like a second skin. She moved toward the door, hand steady despite the cold cutting through her gloves. "Come inside," she said, her voice firm. The words carried authority, but beneath it was the urgency of compassion. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking nervously toward the horizon. They will kill me," he rasped, each word labored and raw with fear. "Who?" she asked, reaching for a thick wool blanket in the corner. The wind rattled the cabin like a living creature trying to enter. "The soldiers, bounty hunters," he whispered. "They track my people. I am the last." Elara's hands trembled as she draped the blanket over his shoulders. She had seen enough cruelty in the West to know fear when it glinted in a man's eyes. And yet, leaving him to freeze and bleed in the snow was unthinkable. He stumbled toward the cabin, and she guided him gently. Inside, the warmth from the stove hit his face, and for a moment, the tension in his body eased. He sank onto the rough wooden bench, breathing shallowly, eyes scanning the cabin like a wary animal. "I'm Elara," she said, standing back to let him take in the small space. "And you are?" "Maric," he replied, voice low and ragged. His eyes, dark and wide, studied her with a mixture of relief and suspicion. She went to her larder, pulling salted meat, a crusty loaf of bread, and a flask of water. He ate cautiously, every bite measured as if savoring life itself. She watched him, noting the fine lines of his hands, calloused yet precise, and the strength beneath the exhaustion. "You're brave," she said, finally breaking the silence. Most would have turned away in this storm. He shook his head, lips curling in a faint grimace. "I had no choice. If I stopped, they would have found my family. I am the last to escape." Her chest tightened. Loss had followed her like a shadow. Her parents gone, neighbors long scattered, her life solitary, punctuated only by the unyielding work of survival. She recognized that same haunted look in Maric's eyes, and her resolve hardened. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, battering the cabin with icy nails. Elara tended his wounds, washing the cuts, wrapping the ragged tunic with clean cloth, pouring antiseptic slowly from her small bottle. She worked in silence, listening to the howling wind and the crackling fire, feeling the pulse of life in the cabin. Night fell, dragging darkness over the plains. The snowstorm's fury outside made it nearly impossible to hear the faintest sounds: footsteps, voices, horses, yet she stayed alert, rifle within reach, every muscle taut. Maric's eyes fluttered. Opened intermittently, and when they did, he whispered, "You trust me?" His voice was hoarse, desperate. "I trust my instincts," she said, letting her gaze linger on him. "My instincts tell me you need help. That's enough for now." He closed his eyes again, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. She watched the firelight play across his face and wondered at the strange mix of relief and fear that made him human. He was fierce, strong, yet broken by circumstance, much like herself. Time stretched, and Elara moved between tending him and keeping watch. Her eyes caught every movement outside, her ears straining for the crunch of snow that would betray the approach of men. She kept the rifle close, the wooden stock warm against her palms, a line of defense between life and death. What did they want? She asked at last, kneeling beside him. "They want the last of my people," he murmured. "They want me alive only to punish those who survived before me." "You won't let that happen," she said firmly, though her own mind raced. It was one thing to help a man in need, another to invite a storm of bullets and hatred to her doorstep. But as she spoke, she realized she already had chosen. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin, rattling windows and doors. Every shadow in the firelight seemed to move. Every gust sounded like hooves in the distance. She could not allow fear to rule her, but she would not lie to herself. Hiding Maric was dangerous, perhaps deadly. Yet when she looked at him, curled on the bench, eyes half closed from exhaustion and pain, she could not regret her decision. Compassion demanded courage, and courage demanded action. "Rest now," she whispered, pulling the blanket tighter around him. "You need strength if you are to survive." He stirred slightly, mumbling a name she could not understand, then drifted into a shallow sleep. She watched, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her mind replaying possible scenarios, escape routes, and the distant ridges where riders might appear. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in a white fury. Inside, firelight flickered over rough logs, over blood and snow, over the fragile bond forming between two souls who had stumbled together at the edge of death. Hours later, Elara sat by the window, rifle across her lap, scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there, someone hunted him. She could feel it in the air, in the way the wind shifted, in the subtle crunch of snow under invisible feet. The storm would not protect them forever. And when it ended, danger would come. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to feel something she hadn't in years: responsibility, purpose, and a deep, fierce sense of justice. She had taken a risk, opened her doors to a stranger, and now her life was irrevocably intertwined with his. Maric stirred again, eyes opening, meeting hers. "You're alone," he said, awe threading his words. "I've been alone for years," she replied softly. "But tonight, I'm not, and neither are you." The wind wailed, a lament across the plains, carrying snow and whispers of the unknown. The fire crackled, the blood still warm, and the storm outside raged like a living thing, relentless and unforgiving. Elara's gaze returned to the dark horizon, every muscle coiled, every sense alert. They had survived the storm, but she knew, with the certainty that comes to those who have faced the edge, that this was only the beginning dot, and somewhere, out there in the white wilderness, danger was coming. The morning light was a muted wash of gray, diffused through the lingering clouds of the storm. The snow outside Elara's cabin glimmered with an icy brilliance, reflecting the pale winter sun like shards of glass. She stirred the embers of the fire, sending warmth curling across the cabin's rough wooden walls. Maric lay against the bench, his breathing steadier but still shallow, his dark eyes alert to every shift in light and shadow. "They'll be back," he said, voice low and tense, cutting through the quiet hum of the stove. His gaze drifted to the horizon, dark and distant. "They never forget. They will follow my tracks." Elara nodded, pulling on her thick wool coat and boots. She had already scouted the surrounding land earlier, noting the ridges and ravines that could serve as cover. She knew the Arizona plains were as beautiful as they were merciless. A single misstep could mean death, not just for Maric, but for both of them. "You're going to stay here," she said, voice firm but calm. "I need to see what's coming." Maric frowned, frustration flickering across his face. "You shouldn't. It's dangerous." "I've survived storms worse than men," she interrupted, moving toward the door. "And I'm not about to let you face them alone." The wind bit at her cheeks as she stepped onto the porch, the snow crunching under her boots. She scanned the horizon. There. Faint impressions in the soft snow, a trail of horse hooves, the careful pattern of a scout moving quietly, methodically. 2 mounted men, likely cavalry or bounty hunters, followed her cabin's tracks from the night before. They had not seen the storm as a barrier, but as a path to track Maric's escape. Elara's mind worked quickly. She studied the ridges, noting narrow ravines and gullies where shadows pooled. The wind favored them. It masked the faint crunch of snow underfoot, yet she knew every second counted. Returning inside, she motioned for Maric to follow. "We need to move," she whispered. "There's a ravine a few miles northeast deep, with high cliffs and hidden crevices. If we can reach it, they won't find us easily." Maric rose slowly, wincing as he shifted his weight. The bloodstains had dried on his tunic, but the ache remained. I trust you," he said, the words careful and deliberate. "Lead the way." They packed what little supplies Elara had left: dried meat, bread, a flask of water, and a hunting knife. She tied the blanket around Maric's shoulders, and together they slipped into the snow, moving quietly across the plains. The wind carried the faint scent of pine from distant trees, mixed with the metallic tang of blood that clung to Maric's hair. The scouts were methodical, sweeping the land with practiced precision. Every now and then, Elara froze, listening, calculating their distance. They had seen nothing yet, but one misstep would reveal them. She guided Maric in a zigzag pattern, breaking the natural flow of tracks, until the trail became a tangle of disrupted snow that would confuse any pursuer. Hours passed in tense silence. Maric struggled to keep pace, but his determination never faltered. "You've been alone here long?" he asked suddenly, voice rasping. Elara considered the question. "Since my parents died." "The land can be harsh, but it teaches you things, how to survive, how to read danger before it finds you." He nodded, dark eyes thoughtful. I never had a place to learn that. Always running, always hiding. My people. I was the last to escape." She glanced at him, noting the blend of pride and sorrow etched into his features. "You're stronger than most give credit for," she said quietly. "But we can't rely on strength alone. We need cunning, strategy." As the sun climbed higher, the snow began to harden, making movement slower and more taxing. Maric's breath came in ragged bursts, his face pale under the frost. Elara adjusted the blanket around him, pressing her gloved hand to his shoulder. "We rest here," she said, pointing toward a cluster of boulders and a hidden crevice. "No one can see us from the ridge, and it's sheltered from the wind." They huddled together inside the narrow space, bodies pressed against the rocks for warmth. Maric's eyes closed briefly, exhaustion pulling him toward sleep, but Elara kept watch. Outside, the wind whistled through the ravine, carrying faint, almost imperceptible sounds of movement. "They're closer than I thought," Maric murmured, eyes snapping open. "I can feel them." Elara nodded. "They've learned our trail. But they won't see us here. Not unless they search every crevice and cliff." The day wore on, and shadows shifted across the snow. Elara felt her muscles tighten with every sound, every subtle shift in light. She thought of her cabin, her solitary life, and how quickly it had been replaced with purpose. This was more than survival. It was protection, courage, and a defiance of the cruelty she had grown accustomed to in the West. Maric watched her in silence for a moment. "You didn't have to do this," he said finally. "You didn't have to risk yourself." She gave a faint smile, lips barely touching the words. "Sometimes doing nothing is far more dangerous. And sometimes the right choice isn't the safe one." He leaned back against the rocks, letting the tension seep out of his body. The crevice offered some shelter from the wind, but the cold gnawed at their fingers and faces. Elara shared some of her bread and meat, watching him eat slowly, almost reverently. It reminded her of the first night he had stumbled into her cabin hungry, desperate, and alive only by luck and courage. Hours later, movement in the distance caught her eye. Shadows flitted along the ridges, faint shapes moving against the snow. She stiffened, signaling Maric to stay low. Two mounted figures, clearly scouts, passed within the valley below, scanning the snow for signs of tracks. Elara's breath hitched as she calculated their path. They were close, far too close. "They'll be back with more," Maric whispered, his voice tense. "They always come back." Elara nodded. "We'll be ready." She scanned the terrain, noting where rocks jutted out, where the snow piled high enough to conceal movement. "If they search here, we'll slip to the west ridge. There's a dense thicket beyond the cliff perfect for hiding. And the wind will mask our tracks." Maric studied her, the dark intensity in his eyes mingling with admiration. "You've done this before," he said quietly. "I've survived more than storms," she replied. "And sometimes the land teaches you lessons that no one else can." The day faded and twilight crept across the snowy plains. Elara kept watch as Maric slept fitfully, wrapping the blanket tighter around his shoulders whenever he shivered. She felt a strange kinship with him, both outcasts in different ways, both hardened by survival and now bound by circumstance and trust. Night fell fully, and with it, the sounds of the plains changed. The wind became a low moan, echoing through the ravine, carrying whispers of unseen dangers. Elara adjusted her rifle, scanning the shadows. Somewhere beyond the snow, men were searching. But she was confident in their hiding place. This narrow crevice and the surrounding ridges would keep them safe. For now, Maric stirred, waking to the cold. "How long? Before we move?" he asked, voice tired but steady. "Dawn," she replied. "We move at first light. The scouts will rest. The snow will hide us better in the low light. And we'll follow the ridge to the thicket, then they'll lose our trail entirely." He nodded, settling back against the rock. "I've never met anyone like you," he murmured. "A woman, alone, willing to risk herself for a stranger." Elara smiled faintly, glancing at him in the flickering moonlight. "Sometimes doing the right thing is all we can do. And sometimes it leads to more than survival." The night stretched on, the cold gnawing, the shadows shifting. Outside, the faint sound of horses' hooves in the distance reminded them that the hunt was far from over. But inside the narrow crevice, warmth from their bodies and the quiet, determination between them created a fragile sanctuary. Elara felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had chosen to hide Maric. She had chosen to fight the injustice and cruelty of the West, and though danger loomed, though the men tracking them were relentless, she knew that courage, cunning, and trust were their only weapons, and somewhere, beyond the ridges and the snow, the hunters would discover that escaping Elara and Maric would not be simple. They were not alone. They had each other. And that, she realized with quiet certainty, was enough to survive for now. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying a bitter chill across the ravine where Elara and Maric had taken shelter. The first light of dawn painted the snow in cold shades of gray and silver, casting long, eerie shadows over the cliffs. Elara stirred the embers of their small fire, sending a wisp of smoke curling up into the sky. Maric sat beside her, shivering despite the blanket wrapped tightly around his shoulders. "They'll be coming," he muttered, dark eyes scanning the horizon. "I can feel it." Elara nodded. Her own instincts screamed the same warning. She had survived storms, lone wolves, and the unpredictable cruelty of men, but this was different. These were men who would not stop, who would not hesitate to kill for the bounty on Maric's head. And they were getting closer. "We need to move back to the cabin," she said quietly, voice steady. "We can't stay in this ravine forever. It's hidden, yes, but it's temporary. I can fortify the cabin, set traps, and we'll have cover. The snow will slow them down, and the land will work in our favor." Maric hesitated, doubt and exhaustion etched across his face. "We'll go back into the open? After all we've done to escape?" Elara reached for his hand, gripping it briefly. "Because we don't have a choice. We fight smart, or we fight nowhere." They descended the ridge carefully, slipping through pockets of snow that masked their tracks. The cold bit into their exposed skin, and Maric winced as his side protested with every step. Elara offered quiet encouragement. "Almost there. Keep moving." By late morning, the cabin appeared through a curtain of flurries, snow clinging to the roof and porch like frozen lace. At first glance, it seemed deserted, peaceful, but Elara knew the calm was a deception. She could feel the tension in the land, the anticipation of predators drawn to scent and movement. "Inside quickly," she urged. Maric obeyed, limping across the porch with her steadying hand. She bolted the door, checked the windows, and began stacking firewood strategically against the walls, creating barriers and hiding spots. Maric watched her work, awe mingled with relief. "You've done this before," he said quietly. Elara paused, glancing at him with a faint smile. "A little. But today, it's for more than survival. It's for justice." Hours passed in a tense, almost surreal quiet. Then, in the distance, a faint sound reached her ears, hooves crunching the snow rhythmically, steadily, approaching from the far ridge. Elara froze, hand on the rifle, breath held. Maric followed her gaze, body stiff. "They're scouts," he whispered. "2 of them, maybe 3. Checking the land." Elara nodded. She crouched beside the door, eyes narrowing. "They're not alone. Not this time." Minutes stretched into an eternity as the shadows of the riders crested the distant ridge. The wind carried faint words in the cold air, commands and curses shouted to the horizon. Elara's mind raced. If these men discovered Maric, it wouldn't be just his life at stake, it would be hers as well. She motioned to Maric to move behind a reinforced wall of firewood. "Stay low. Watch and wait. Don't move unless I tell you." The scouts circled the cabin, their horses snorting in the cold. One dismounted, shaking snow from his coat, scanning the ground for tracks. Elara held her breath, every muscle taut. She counted seconds in her head, each one heavier than the last. Then, faintly, in the distance, she saw them, hundreds of figures rising over the horizon. Mounted warriors, their movements purposeful and disciplined. Her heart leapt, not for fear, but for the unexpected surge of hope that accompanied the realization. Maric's people were coming. They came, he breathed, eyes wide with disbelief. They really came? Elara felt a thrill she hadn't experienced in years. Relief surged through her veins, yet caution remained. The approaching warriors were powerful, but the men hunting Maric would not give up easily. The bounty hunters on the ridge were about to face an army they could not imagine. From her vantage point, she saw the first scout pause, sensing movement in the distance, then signaled the others. The hunt was about to clash with something far greater than a lone fugitive. Elara and Maric took positions behind the cabin's walls. She adjusted the rifle, loading it carefully, her hand steady despite the adrenaline. Maric gripped his knife, eyes sharp and alert. For a moment, they simply watched, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The bounty hunters charged down the ridge. When they realized their numbers were insufficient to face the approaching warriors, panic rippled through their ranks as the Apache warriors formed lines, a tide of humanity moving with precision and purpose. They shouted commands, their voices carrying authority and warning across the plains. Elara felt a shiver run down her spine, but it was not fear, it was awe. She had hidden one man, and in return, his people had come to reclaim justice. The snow crunched under horses' hooves, the cold air vibrating with anticipation. Maric approached her side, eyes bright. You saved everything," he said, voice trembling. Elara shook her head. "No, you saved your people. I only gave you a chance." The bounty hunters faltered, realizing they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. One of them fired a shot, but the Apache warriors were already in motion, intercepting and disarming with practiced skill. Elara ducked instinctively behind the wall of logs as a stray bullet thudded into the wood beside her. Time seemed to slow. The snow swirled like powdered glass, masking movement and adding a surreal layer to the chaos. Horses whinnied, men shouted, and the cabin shook with the intensity of the confrontation. Maric moved with surprising agility, aiding the warriors and disarming the few hunters who had advanced too close. When the dust and snow settled, the bounty hunters were gone, retreating into the distance, leaving behind discarded weapons and trampled snow. Elara emerged cautiously, eyes scanning the aftermath. The Apache warriors had formed a protective circle around the cabin, horses pawing the snow, riders watching the horizon. Maric turned to her, gratitude and wonder etched into his face. "They would have died without you," he said softly. Elara smiled faintly. No exhaustion tugged at her shoulders. "You would have fought. You wouldn't have let them take you without a fight. We just gave each other a chance." The Apache leader dismounted, riding forward with authority and respect. His attire shimmered with tribal jewelry, feathers catching the sunlight. He stopped in front of Elara, eyes piercing and assessing. "You saved him," the leader said simply. "You saved him from death. For that, your life is protected. Your cabin is safe, and your actions will not be forgotten." Elara inclined her head, silent, absorbing the gravity of the moment. She had acted out of compassion, out of a sense of justice, yet this acknowledgment was overwhelming. She had survived alone for years, but never had she felt such connection, such a recognition of her choices. Maric approached the leader, bowing respectfully. "She gave me shelter when no one else would," he said. "Without her, I would not be here." The leader nodded, signaling his warriors to encircle the cabin fully, ensuring no threat remained. The snow-covered land seemed to hold its breath, the silence settling like a blanket over the aftermath. Elara's gaze shifted to the horizon, now quiet and empty. The storm had passed, and so had the immediate danger. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax. Though her senses remained alert. Maric reached for her hand, their fingers brushing in a quiet acknowledgement of shared experience, of survival and trust. "You risked everything," he said. "And I would do it again," she replied. "Because sometimes doing nothing is far more dangerous than any storm, any hunter, any army." The Apache warriors began to settle, tying their horses and establishing temporary camps around the cabin. Maric's people were alive and safe, and the snow that had once threatened to bury them now glistened under a pale afternoon sun, reflecting hope and resilience, Elara watched them, heart swelling with a strange mixture of awe, pride, and satisfaction. Her small, isolated cabin had become the center of a larger story, a place of refuge, courage, and consequence. She had entered the storm alone, hiding a man from death, and now an entire community had come to honor that act. Maric turned to her, eyes soft. This is more than I imagined. You've changed everything." She shook her head. "We changed it together. Survival is never just one person. It's decisions, courage, and sometimes trust." Night fell, spreading a blanket of stars over the snow-covered plains. The wind whispered softly through the trees and ridges, carrying the scent of pine and fire smoke. Elara and Maric stood side by side, watching the Apache warriors settle for the night. Knowing that the battle was won for now, the snow had revealed its danger and its beauty. The plains had tested them both, and in the process had bound them together. And as the firelight danced across the cabin walls, Elara felt a quiet certainty. They were no longer alone, and the choices they had made would ripple across the land far beyond what they could see. The morning sun broke through the dissipating clouds, painting the snow-covered plains with pale gold light. Silence hung over the land, broken only by the distant sounds of the Apache warriors preparing to move on. Their horses stamped the ground, sending small clouds of powdered snow into the crisp air, while the occasional hammering of saddles and gear filled the space around Elara's cabin. Elara stood on the porch, coat drawn tightly around her shoulders, eyes scanning the horizon. The storm had passed, the bounty hunters were gone, and the immediate danger was over. Yet she felt an unfamiliar restlessness, a tension that would not ease until every threat had vanished completely. Maric approached quietly, the blanket he had been wrapped in now replaced by a sturdier, warmer cloak given to him by the Apache leader. He looked healthier, steadier, no longer the desperate fugitive who had stumbled into her cabin days ago. His dark eyes, still alert, met hers. "They'll return," he said softly, the words carrying a weight she understood without needing explanation. "Other hunters. Other dangers. The West does not forgive easily." Elara shook her head, determination blazing in her gaze. "Let them come. The snow, the land, and your people's honor will see us through. We've already survived worse." Maric smiled faintly, a rare lightness in his expression. "You speak as though you've always known courage like this. Yet you've lived alone, fighting the land itself." "I've lived alone," she admitted, "but that doesn't mean I've been without strength. I only found it when I needed it most, when I had a choice to make." The Apache warriors began their preparations to leave, forming a protective perimeter around the cabin. Maric's people moved with the quiet efficiency of those who had survived countless hardships, ready for anything. Elara helped where she could, fetching supplies and assisting the wounded who had accompanied the warriors. Her hands steady and capable despite the lingering chill in the air. The moment was almost surreal, the snow sparkling. The wind softened, and the world seeming to exhale after days of turmoil. And yet, beneath the calm, Elara could feel the tension of unspoken stories, of debts paid and favors returned, of courage tested against the harshness of the West. Maric turned to her, voice quiet but earnest. "I should have never come here. I should have run, hidden, stayed alone. But you gave me life again, and my people will not forget it." Elara reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "We survived together, Maric. That's all there is to it. And sometimes, saving one life can change many more." Suddenly, a distant shout carried across the plains, slicing through the quiet. Elara froze, the rifle she had brought with her during the confrontation in her mind suddenly tangible in her hands. The bounty hunters or another group seeking revenge were testing the edges of their victory. "They're testing us," Maric said, already moving toward the ridge to get a better view. "They're cautious now. They'll think twice before approaching the warriors directly." Elara followed, boots crunching in the snow, eyes scanning every shadow. From the top of the ridge, she saw the faint figures approaching, a small band of riders, wary and hesitant, but clearly determined. They were scouts, the type that came first before the full force of men. "They've learned caution," Elara said, voice low. "But we've learned too, and now we make them understand that this land does not forgive injustice." Together, she and Maric descended the ridge slowly, careful to stay hidden. The Apache warriors spread out strategically, creating natural barriers and choke points. The small band of hunters entered the open snow, unaware of the numbers they faced. Elara's mind raced. She had never been a soldier, never sought glory, but she understood strategy. She motioned to Maric to take position with her near the edge of the ridge. "When they see us, when they see the strength here, they'll understand their place." The hunters reached the flat snow-covered ground and froze, realizing they were being observed. From her vantage point, Elara could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear Maric had carried in his. The same fear that had driven him to her cabin days ago. The Apache leader stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. "Leave this land," he commanded. "Leave the man you hunt, or face the wrath of those who will not forgive. We honor life, but we will not tolerate bloodshed for greed." Elara felt a strange thrill. She had stood silently beside him, her presence lending weight to the words, and it was as if the land itself acknowledged her courage. The hunters looked to one another, weighing the odds. Their pursuit had brought them to the edge of a force far beyond their understanding, slowly. Reluctantly, they turned their horses and fled, leaving behind the frozen ground and the snow glistening in sunlight like a field of diamonds. The chase was over. The immediate threat had passed. Maric exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders. "It is done," he said, eyes bright. "Thanks to you, Elara. You've changed the course of this day and perhaps many more to come." Elara shook her head. "You gave them the courage to fight for life. I only offered shelter and strategy. That is all." The Apache warriors moved closer. Offering thanks and respect to Elara, she accepted their gratitude with quiet humility, understanding that her actions, though simple, had consequences far beyond what she could see. They tied their horses and prepared for a long journey, the snow glinting around them like a reminder of the hardships endured and survived. As the day waned, Maric and Elara stood together outside the cabin, watching the last of the warriors ride off toward the distant plains. The sky blazed with shades of pink and gold, and the wind carried the faint scent of pine and distant fires. The snow, once a blanket of fear and isolation, now sparkled like a promise of survival and renewal. Maric turned to her, voice soft, almost reverent. "I don't know how to repay you. You risked everything for a stranger." "For me," Elara shook her head, a small smile forming. "Sometimes repayment is not necessary. Courage is its own reward. And we survived. That is enough." For a moment, they stood in silence, two souls bound by hardship, trust, and the understanding that the West was harsh, but justice could still be carved out by those brave enough to stand. The cabin, once a lonely refuge, had become a symbol of hope and resilience, a testament to the choices that define life and legacy. Maric brushed the snow from his cloak, eyes scanning the horizon one last time. "I will carry this day with me," he said quietly. "And my people will know the woman who saved me, who saved us all." Elara nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and quiet satisfaction. She had survived storms, men, and the unforgiving land. But she had also discovered something new, a connection, a sense of purpose beyond herself. and the knowledge that even in a world defined by cruelty and greed, acts of courage and kindness could change the course of fate. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered plains. The wind, softened now, whispered gently through the trees, carrying with it a promise of peace, however fleeting, and a reminder that survival required not just strength, but trust, courage, and compassion. Maric finally turned to her, a faint smile breaking the stoicism of his features. "This land, this snow, it brought me to you, and perhaps that is the greatest fortune of all." Elara returned the smile, feeling the warmth of victory and trust in the frozen air. "And perhaps it reminds us that even in the harshest winters, life and hope can endure." As night fell fully, the cabin glowed faintly from the dying embers of the fire. Outside, the snow reflected the stars, a silent witness to the courage, choices, and lives forever changed. Elara and Maric stood together, knowing that the West was still wild, still dangerous, but that they had found something worth protecting: trust, survival, and the unbreakable bond forged in the storm. The plains were silent now, the threat gone, the snow settling over the land like a promise. And in that quiet, Elara understood that her life, once solitary, had been transformed not by chance, but by courage, choice, and the refusal to turn away from those who needed her most.